Ladies and gentlemen, we're back again. We got a very special guest this time. We got one of the godfathers of permaculture, somebody who is a design master, somebody who is living the way we all should probably consider living, Mr. David Holmgren. How are you?
Good, and good to speak to you from here in very wet southeastern Australia at Meliadora. It's incredibly wet, which we mostly celebrate in this part of the world.
Is there any threats of flooding in that area, or do you take all the rain you can get?
There is threats of flooding downstream of where we are, but it's been mostly sort of just benign, persistent, incredible wet winter, spring, which is our normal wet season, but in a progressively drying climate, these very wet winter springs are getting rarer and rarer. So the big public reservoirs, some of them in our region, don't fill from one year to another. This year there'll be spillway parties where people are celebrating the overflow of the reservoirs.
Good. Well, always on the lookout for things how things are going. I am in Germany right now, and it's was a dry summer, but now it's beginning to be wet. But we have this threat of being cold all winter and other things. But so, in a nutshell, can you tell everybody who might not know what permaculture is?
Yeah, well, permaculture means different things to different people, and a lot of people would understand it probably as a cool form of organic gardening, but it's really a design system for how we do land use from the back doorstep right to, as we'd say in Australia, the back paddock. So all scales of land use, and with a strong focus on food production, but also with forestry, animal husbandry, all of the ways in which we provide for human needs from a working relationship with nature. But similarly, it's a design system for how we live and organise our lives. So concerned with both the production side of the equation and the consumption side, and bringing those two that have been separate for so many people in the modern world, bringing those back together. So when you produce food in your home garden for yourself and your family outside the monetary economy, that's sort of collapsing what the economists call disintermediation, all of this incredibly long supply chains of complexity that we have built in the modern world. Now, not every aspect of permaculture is doing that, but it's redesigning systems to be more localized, to be more in the hands of the people who benefit and contribute to those systems, rather than those being scaled up to industrial economies of scale, which all our current systems are. So it might start for a lot of people with gardening, but it's equally concerned with how we adapt and retrofit buildings to make them fit for purpose in new and challenging times, right through to all of the way we organise in our households, right through to communities. So in that sense, it addresses a lot of things, but it started with, back in the mid-70s, Bill Mollison and I were looking at the problem of agriculture, because this is a big problem. It's the activity that humans do on more of the planet than any other activity, and it's how we provide our most fundamental needs. And it's basically been completely unsustainable, both in the damage it was causing to nature, but also in its dependence on depleting resources, especially oil and all its byproducts that, of course, include things like fertilizer.
Yeah.
So we are now, nearly 50 years on, 50 years on from the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, which focused a lot on a lot of these issues, and permaculture emerged, not long after that report.
And so not only is it bad with the fertilizer and stuff, but there's just some parts of industrialized agriculture that are just highly inefficient. What are some of the ways that the whole supply chain is inefficient and the system itself is inefficient, and it's swayed towards giving money to the top?
Well, yes, the scale of systems and the complexity of industrial systems allows the mediators in the middle, the intermediators, the corporations who both supply farmers with the products they need, fertilizers, chemicals, fuel, and finance, because of the scale on which farmers are operating, and controlling what consumers have access to. So that controlling the producer and consumer has benefited those corporations and entities in the middle, but is incredibly inefficient in terms of energy and resources at supplying things, especially when it comes to perishable food, fresh fruit and veggies, small livestock products, because those are the things that historically were always grown as close to where people live as possible. And of course, it's only cheap fuel and energy for refrigeration and complex packaging and everything that it's been possible to develop these incredibly long supply chains from huge monocultures remote from where the consumers are. And that's given sort of some claimed efficiencies, like, you can grow things in a climate which can provide early produce, like in the United States, in California, that can then ship that to other places. So these sort of so-called benefits by having everything very large scale and very globalized all depend on cheap, reliably available fossil energy.
Okay, you heard it from him first. Fossil fuels and the agriculture industry, this is unsustainable. We need to rethink the way we get our food and the way we live. So pesticides and herbicides are also, like you mentioned, dumped in large amounts in industrial agriculture. I mean, what are the dangers of these kind of chemicals, and how can permaculture get us to use less?
Well, I suppose the dirty secret of horticulture, the most intensive part of plant agriculture, is that there's a shift in cultivation where people, around large cities that used to be clustered market gardens, and then progressively the soil got trashed and poisoned, and people would sell that up for housing and move further out. Because the more intensive the agriculture and the greater the use of chemicals, both in the form of fertilizers and pesticides, there's all these residual effects and distortions that, even if they're not illegal, in the sense of toxic levels that are banned, they're at levels that are certainly unacceptable in, say, for example, organic standards. So there is that great legacy, and then, of course, there's efforts to sort of try and minimize those problems by developing new pesticides which are less toxic. So there's been this sort of development of efficiency and lower toxicity, but overall the problem keeps getting worse, or the problem becomes more subtle. So you get, for example, insecticides that are systemic insecticides in plants that seem to have these subtle adverse effects on bees. Whereas previously they were just using things like arsenate of lead, which is just straight toxic to the whole of life and accumulates in the soil. Well, a lot of those things, and of course the famous DDT, are no longer used or used in various third world countries, but a lot of the replacements end up having these more subtle problems, such as contributing to a collapse of bees, which is, of course, a worldwide problem. And there's not like there's a single reason for those things. And sometimes people can get sort of over hysterical about I need all of my food to be completely pure. I mean, we live in a world where the natural environment has contaminants in it too, but the cumulative effect of those things is very serious. But the other thing that people don't realise is that these pesticides and other chemicals are very energy intensive to manufacture. And so as energy costs rise, just like the effect on fertilizers, all of these things become more expensive. So if we look at something like one of the most widely used herbicides in the world, Roundup, produced, of course, by Monsanto, the alternative to that from a permaculture point of view, for a lot of the uses that gets used for, just general vegetation management, a goat is the alternative that turns that excess vegetation that people are trying to kill and make a dead zone out of. It turns that into animal products and provides ecological services in the process. And the goat reproduces on the farm and benefits the farm economy, whereas the herbicide is just something that has to be bought and then achieve some value on the farm or in landscape management that justifies itself, and trying not to worry too much about the adverse toxic effects. And those herbicides are a great example that, 30 years ago, I wasn't sure whether glyphosate, the chemical in Roundup, was toxic. The evidence was sort of pretty fragmentary, but we now know its effects on gut flora in animals is absolutely immense, and just the same of its adverse effects on the soil microflora.
Yeah. And I like throughout history, too, we've had this mistake where we welcome technology with an open arm. We say, oh, it's a new product. And we find ourselves 30, 40, 50 years later backpedaling and saying, we shouldn't be spraying DDT anymore as an insecticide, maybe. Or we should not be putting lead in our paint and in our, So, and now when I hear about new technology, I'm very weary. And I just think, I don't need all this progress. I need to digress back into older times.
A lot of the time that is seen as a sort of a romantic response of harking back to the past. But the analysis that is almost not there on so-called progress is that it's actually a greater level of complexity to deal with the problems created by the previous cycle of expanded complexity. Yeah. And of course, there's analyses of civilizations showing that they fail when they can no longer sustain the next level of complexity, and the tidal wave of problems from all the complexity, overwhelm them, and you have to rebuild simple systems.
Yeah.
That example that I started with of home food production being an alternative to all of this enormous complexity, it doesn't mean that everyone has to be like an absolute professional, competent food producer for it to be valuable enough for people to grow some of their own food. And that's the difference in the sort of household economy, simple ways. You don't have to be the absolute professional at whether it's bottling your own fruit or even fixing the car for it to be actually economically and socially, environmentally beneficial to do. So there's huge advantages in rebuilding what we call the household and community non-monetary economies, which a lot of my work in permaculture in recent times has actually focused on that. So how we can do more things for ourselves. But of course that does tend to lead to a decline in GDP, which economists and politicians and bankers see as disastrous.
Yeah, this is the classic short-sighted nature of it. And, I've seen it firsthand hitchhiking across America and seeing what happened to Main Street USA, which basically they take away their people's ability to be the town shoemaker or the town bread baker and stuff like this. And everything becomes corporatized. And so these were replaced with Walmarts, which basically just take all the everything a person could need, subsidize it to kill all the rest of the competition, and then drown out small communities like that. So now we're all on this global kind of network, and it's a bit bizarre. So
I suppose the positive permaculture answer to that is, rather than the failed efforts to try and downscale the corporations back to the small local businesses and all of those things, what we've found is both the policies of the corporations and the policies of governments have made it increasingly difficult for small business. But there's still a huge amount of freedom in the non-monetary economy of the household of people doing things for themselves outside of the regulatory framework. And as I said, you don't have to be a professional to actually get net benefits from those things. And especially when people own or occupy houses that actually have often surplus space and capacity to actually kickstart that household economy doing things for themselves again. Getting the junk out of the garage and setting up a small workshop, making things. And that's how we actually regrow a monetary economy from the things that just people do for themselves. And then some people find they're actually really good at it and that they can actually do it and other people will pay them for it in the grey economy outside of all of that controlled centre. So that is a sort of a positive pathway by which both we can be more self-reliant, but over the longer term, we can rebuild a localised economy from the bottom up, rather than saying, how do we get together at a big political level and reform this larger scale system and recreate the sort of human scale economy that we want. Because efforts in that direction, and people articulating that for most of my life have sort of mostly gone backwards.
Yeah.
So, let's try a different strategy.
And David said it great. It's the gray zone. It's the you're with your friends, neighbors, colleagues, people around you. You're rebuilding community and trying to keep your own economy and separate yourself from the system as is. So you deal with soil health sometimes, and a lot of the stuff that happens with industrial agriculture, the soil gets depleted really easily, and I've had to work with some pretty bad soil over the years. What are some of the things that you can recommend for helping depleted soil?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a number of sort of different situations. A lot of our agriculture these days is on our best soils, but have been enormously damaged. And there's a lot of work in the organic and regenerative agricultural fields that have worked on that with beneficial microbes, with remineralization, with cover crops, and of course shifting from just dependence on annual crops to perennial tree crops, which was one of the great focus of the early work in permaculture, to reduce our dependence on crops that involved cultivation of the soil each year, and also the shift to greater use of rotations, especially legumes, to provide nitrogen fixation. So there are many different techniques there that are both being developed in alternative organic regenerative agriculture fields that we would see as part of the suite of permaculture solutions. But there's also the ways of growing food on marginal soils that agriculture has long abandoned or doesn't think it's possible to grow food. And one of the great examples of this was in the crisis in Cuba in the 90s with food shortages, where people who had no knowledge of agriculture just started growing vegetables on the rocky outcrops in the vacant land around Havana. And Cuba actually does have a lot of really good agricultural soil. And of course, the scientists said, oh, no, you can't grow food there. But there were permaculture activists from Australia who said, oh, yeah, we just grow gardens wherever. You know, you just get lots of organic matter, and even if it's on ground that's just solid clay or even. And so what people were just sort of doing without sort of knowing whether this would work became the basis of the organobotanico sort of raised bed intensive vegetable growing system, which is actually still today part of the mainstream food supply system in Cuba, because they didn't go back to, oh, we'll get all the cabbages from one farm at the other end of Cuba and bring them all to Havana, you know. So they kept that. And the part that permaculture played in that was quite a small part, but it was this inspiration that, well, sort of at the garden scale, you can grow food on you know, the most crummy land, if you like. And I suppose sheet mulch gardening was the technique that in Australia in the late 70s, early 80s, people thought that's what permaculture was, you know, of getting large amounts of organic matter, putting down newspaper over compacted grass and lawn areas and creating an instant garden. Now, it's not a technique for perpetually producing food on a sustainable cycle, but it's a way of quickly establishing garden systems on very difficult soils using abundant organic matter, which is often available as waste streams. You know, lawn clippings, leaves raked up from deciduous trees, animal manures, food waste, all of these things, and a sort of an in situ composting. So that is it's just one technique, but it's something that empowered a lot of people to start food gardens.
Yeah, and especially tree leaves people. This has got a great nitrogen, potassium, NPK. It's just really, really great and full of nutrients. So it's good compost. So right now it's a really tough time because permaculture has been on the fringes for so long, and corporations are now offering us stuff in green packages to address our concerns about climate change, and they're trying to kind of greenwash this stuff. Do you think it's kind of disingenuous to do this, and or do you think we need to rethink our consumption habits?
Well, there's a couple of different levels to the issue. Firstly, yes, the perception that new green technology, carbon neutral technology will allow us to consume energy and resources in the same way we've been doing, but it won't be damaging to the planet. I think that is a delusion, and it's a delusion that's not just cynically in the corporations. It also occurs across the tech sector, and especially in the renewable energy sector, the electricity sector, where there's been great strides in beginning to replace fossil fuels in the electricity sector, which is 18% of total global energy. The rest is transport and industrial use and whatever, which is all fossil fuels pretty much is. So there's been some sort of progress in that, but unless you are honest and say we actually need a massive downscaling of the human project, and that most of that has to happen for the 1 or 2 billion middle class people. Sure, the rich also should stop flying in their private jets and eating so much caviar and champagne, but they're so few in number that actually their consumption, their power and control of the system is really important, but their actual consumption is not so important. It's the 1 to 2 billion middle class people on the planet that is the vast majority of the consumption, and that has to massively downscale. So that is disingenuous, including right down to our mainstream green political parties who don't want to, sell that message.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's also the ways in which that happens increasingly actually through catastrophe, because I believe the elites are now working in ways that instead of just promoting the smooth green tech transition, they're actually looking at a sort of really a controlled demolition of what already exists, because they know it's too late to sort of, do constantly sell the, I think what is being experienced in Europe, and the need to sort of deindustrialize and everyone shrink their consumption, that is actually a perception from the top that that's actually what's needed. So rather than denying climate change or denying resource depletion, they're actually a bit desperate about it, but they're doing it, of course, in a way that tries to preserve power at the top. And, of course, that means everyone else and nature ends up paying one way or another. So it's a tricky situation, because there's also the pushback that the lack of trust at the top means there's increasing numbers of people who resent and reject that and see that as a mad green agenda to, like in Germany, that the push to try and go really fast into renewable energy was actually a really crazy mistake. And, all of these sort of green ideology that's actually causing all these problems, and there wouldn't really be any problems if we just stuck with the old ways. So that's also, I think misguided, but understandable that people think that way. So we're now in a situation where there is no trust, and there's 1,000 different voices, all with their own perceptions of what the problem is as we move deeper and deeper into the crisis, and how much of that is just humans shooting themselves in the foot, creating crisis, versus no, nature is actually setting limits to the human project after humans have long denied that there are limits.
And to be absolutely fair, some of the voices in the crowd that are contributing to this madness happen to be paid for by people like Chevron and Exxon, they're constantly, creating fake presence on the internet, trying to manufacture consensus by having these fake people on the internet commenting, saying, yeah, the green energy is dumb and the climate change is a hoax. And it's just... So
the thing is that what we have to accept is there's enormous uncertainty, and that people in our communities and people directly believing different things, we need to have humility about saying, okay, what do we need to get on with? So, for example, if we are talking to someone who doesn't believe in climate change and various other things, that's actually not necessary to see that we have common purpose in becoming more self-reliant and more community interdependent, and that might involve a combination of making use of existing technologies that are created by corporations, such as solar panels on our roof, but it also might make use of a very efficient wood heater manufactured by a small engineering business, or it might even be a little rocket stove that we build in the backyard out of rubbish that can use stick fuel with very little pollution and cook some food. That it might involve all of those things, and that we don't need to sit down and come to an agreement about, what is the state of whose fault the state of the world is to do things. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it might be just more exhilarating and more fun for everybody to play the blame game. It certainly seems to be fun.
I think that's sort of playing out, on multiple parties and sides, but it also, we can see that sometimes people's anger is sort of manufactured through the internet and other things. But in other ways, it's also people's circumstances, people understanding their circumstances, and the circumstances for their children are actually contracting. And of course, that is the fuel for fascist politics in all sorts of different forms.
Yeah.
And that those expressions are coming in different ways. So I think it is important to sort of look outside the window, see what one can see oneself, and yes, understanding what's happening in the world at a larger scale. But remember, we're all being gamed all the time in this sort of crisis. And
I'm so glad you say that, because that makes me feel a lot better. Because we're in it together, because I have to look out. I also do the same thing. You look around you, look at the resources you have, and realize as long as your neighborhood is on fire, you have a chance to make the world you want to see. But we're being gamed at all times, that's for sure. But and we've been gamed for a long time. Our Western values have been focused around the idea of technological progress and capitalism being good, and now it's pretty clear that it's harmful to the environment. Do you know of actually examples in indigenous societies where they were doing a better job living with the environment rather than dominating it?
Well, both what we call indigenous cultures, original people cultures, even though that's a sort of a difficult term, and also all traditional cultures of place had a huge influence in the original conception of permaculture and its ongoing evolution. And I'd sort of give two examples. Firstly, in Australia, the most infertile continent with the most unstable climate, and I don't mean that just in today's terms, but over the last 50,000 years, people, indigenous people here, developed a culture of land management, created a cultivated landscape, which was optimal for the support of people, but also the maintenance of biodiversity, and without any institutionalized conflict on the scale of warfare where, whole tribes swept across the continent and wiped out others. None of that ever happened in Australia as far as we can tell. And so there was codes of reciprocity that extended across the continent, which dealt with the issues and contained the issues of conflict between groups. And that may have come about partly because there wasn't enough resources in Australia that it was worth rushing over the hill to conquer and take over those people's territory, that you more likely would have failed and drive yourself down through that process. Whereas in other parts of the world, that strategy of warfare actually sort of worked. So for the last 6,000 years, it's been a big problem on the planet. So I think that's one example of sustainable societies that have maintained a balance with the environment, and from all the evidence that people were living at a level where they were below the carrying capacity of their local environment and resources, mostly living in incredible abundance. Now, there's debates amongst archaeologists and anthropologists about whether that was just because there were particularly good times when Europeans arrived or whatever, and also that the diseases of crowding had already arrived and the populations had been impacted, and there was this just limitless food and landscape everywhere, and people's management of the land had already reduced, or also that Australia's climate is so unstable that people had actually maintained their populations in a very conservative way to allow for that huge fluctuation. But whatever it is, there's an enormous amount to learn from that. And of course, it was just a couple of years before I met Bill Mollison that the anthropologist and ecologist Rhys Jones coined the term fire stick farming to describe how Aboriginal people managed the land. So that's one example. The other example I'd choose at the moment is Edo, Japan, before the Meiji Restoration in 1860 at the point of American guns. Japan had 60 million people on those limited islands. 70% of the country was forested. 78%, I think it was up to. So they weren't, they had the landscape in a stable, balanced structure. And there was a conservative society that was not based on growth, but poured human creativity into things like tea ceremony or things that didn't actually use a lot of resources, that could occupy human creativity without constantly what humans do when they're sort of, let's have this big project and let's build all these things. No, 60 million people without fossil fuels, without an outside empire, without outside subsidy, were in a sustainable, balanced pattern on those islands, which is pretty amazing because that's like half, the current population, a little bit less than half the current population. But of course, today, Japan depends on, fossil fuels and imported resources, and even saying that, it's way more efficient in all of the way it does things than most other affluent countries. So a book written by an American author who's lived in Japan, Just Enough, I'm trying to think of his name, we had a discussion online about, the connections between permaculture and Japanese traditional systems. So, that's just two examples. But, everywhere, a lot of permaculture has been inspired and directly makes use of those indigenous and what I call traditional cultures of place embedded in their landscape and with a reverence for that landscape.
Yeah. There were times in history where we actually had it right, and we decided to divert from that in the name of progress and so on. So, you've been doing this for a long time. And I know that when you start talking about sustainable living, you are at odds with some of the hierarchical forces in the world, like corporations and, billionaires and stuff. And have you ever felt the pressure or personally hindered or professionally hindered or silenced from spreading kind of the gospel of permaculture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suppose not particularly, but that's partly, I think, because I followed a strategy of personal autonomy and maybe not putting as a priority going to go out and change the world, that more change oneself, focus on small things that you can do. And, as a public intellectual outside of academia, never depending on funding or all of those structures, and working in a small business model of teaching, book authoring, publishing, and what used to be my original work, mostly permaculture design consultancy for people rather than corporations. But I have noticed that as in the last 20 years, especially with the publication of my major theory text on permaculture, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, published in 2002, that it was very hard to get any mainstream media coverage of that. And you say, well, it's a really complex book of ideas, but they weren't even interested in the fact that as a publishing phenomena, that this book, was actually sort of sold all these copies and then was published in 7 languages, and is actually, after we boycotted Amazon and the big distribution things and did our own distribution, that it's still been relatively successful. Trying to get mainstream media even interested in that as a publishing story. And the same thing happened with my big book, Retro Suburbia, The Downshifter's Guide to a Resilient Future, which came out in 2018. It's had no mainstream reviews in Australia. It's a full colour, 600-page book. It's like really 3 books in one. $85, printed in Australia when all books are printed in China. Has sold 15,000 copies. And the mainstream media are not interested. So that sort of story, they, sort of do indicate not being silenced, but sort of, I suppose, being ignored when you could say, well, this is the sort of, even if you're not interested in the ideas, you say, gee, that's pretty curious.
Right. This starts your conspiracy kind of paranoid train of thought. You go, what is happening here? I'm doing fine by it, but nobody there, because there is obviously something at the heart of that. But makes sense. I can't say I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I mean, another example would be in my Retro Suburbia work. I've emphasised this strategy that local government could do of encouraging people to take in a boarder, a renter, to sort of help solve the housing crisis and, obviate the need to knocking down suburban houses and building apartments and whatever. We've got this huge underused housing stock, and it would be better for the environment, better for society, and better for the individuals involved to have more people sharing in some way. And, but the reality is that strategy would result in a reduction in GDP. And after I'd done one of these presentations at a big event called the Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne, I had a planner come up to me who was a planner in the State Department of Planning. And he said, you know, your sort of taking a border strategy came up in a brainstorming session at the department about how do we get more urban density in Melbourne, a city of, 4 million plus people. And at this mention that, you could encourage people to take in a border, everyone in the room apparently laughed in acknowledgement and then went back to discussing how do we persuade Melburnians to accept more apartment blocks, filling in their suburbs with high rise. Because I think people involved in that actually recognise that that is actually subversive. Yes, it would address the issue and it would have all of these other benefits, but it's actually economic terrorism.
Right.
So, the work I'm proposing is actually economic terrorism. And so it's not surprising that.
Well, you guys could stop shooting yourselves in the foot. Yeah, no, we have to keep shooting ourselves in the foot, but we just want to figure out a way to bandage it after the fact. It's like, okay. So, we got a few minutes left here. So as this situation of climate change continues and it's becoming more obvious and more intense, what is some, what is something hopeful? What is something that the young people with limited resources might be able to do to help? Like we just explained, it's things we can do on a small scale. Like I grow mushrooms in my back room, and they're delicious oyster mushrooms. They're nutritious, stuff like that.
Fantastic. There's a huge interest in that. There's a huge interest in edible weeds and learning all the culinary aspects of edible weeds and foraging. Of course, there's a huge culture developing of repair cafes and people upskilling in repairing devices through to bicycles. So all of these things that actually empower people to have that are enlightened self-interest rather than just this is what I'm doing for the good of the world. Because when those things come together, when you are doing something where you get an immediate benefit, there's a benefit for society and there's a benefit for the environment, and you're increasing your own resilience to shocks and challenges that are coming, then those things are really empowering. And I think a lot of those things are drawing people to permaculture, and our contribution to that has been to support in the last few years, apart from my own big work in retro suburbia and all the resources we have online for that, which is a little bit more focused on people who are getting grounded, committed to place, maybe in a family home with children. You might even say more socially conservative, whereas Rosemary Morrow's new book, Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture, is in a sense a lighthouse beaming out for young people looking at how they can contribute and how they can do things for themselves and in ways that are beneficial for communities and beneficial for the planet, and a very sort of global view in that book. And she's worked across the world in refugee camps and some of the most sort of disabled places with permaculture teaching, and has distilled all this life's work into this new book. So they're sort of examples of permaculture with sort of different lens and focus of, because everyone's in different situation and different stage of life and different context. And we've tried to do that too within our retro suburbia book, of seeing this decision-making matrix of should we consolidate somewhere we know, or should we migrate to somewhere that has better prospects, or move away from bad things that are happening? And that's on one axis. And that crossing over with, do we power up and try and control our domestic environment for greater resilience, or do we downsize and disown and simplify and to be flexible? And that ends up creating 4 solution spaces, which actually suit people at different stages of life and in different circumstances. So we're trying to sort of give a lot of those tools, thinking tools, for people to, do what they can. And your example of, people living in apartments, growing mushrooms, incredible, nutritious food, spectacularly beautiful things. And the technology of doing that has become domesticated, simplified, including our colleagues at Milkwood Permaculture, who've done an enormous amount in teaching people these basic techniques that used to be lab techniques, these very simple techniques for growing cultivated mushrooms in a basement or a back room.
Yeah, that's incredible. And and I've slowly learned that there is some hope, and there is some things you can do, and especially every act that you can do where you take money out of the fiat economic system, and in these gray zones, like David said, we're making a stand. And doing what David does is the ultimate, most punk rock activist kind of thing that you can do right now, is to figure out how to get these systems in your own hands again. So we're running out of time on the meeting. I want to thank David for coming on. We're going to check back with him in the next few months, and hopefully have him back, because why not?
Okay, good to talk to you.
All right.